Tonight's tale is both ridiculous and sublime. It smells faintly of marble, roses, and poor decisions. It is the story of Emperor Nero, Rome's most flamboyant fire hazard, and the gallery of imperial eccentrics who made the first century feel like a particularly chaotic reality show. Before we dive too deeply, a gentle nudge. If you enjoy stories that let you relax and learn at the same time, consider liking this video and subscribing to History at Bedtime. Also, feel free to leave a comment sharing your location and local time. We like to see history travel the globe alongside our viewers. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey. You wake, in imagination at least, inside the marble halls of the Palatine Hill. Rome glows beneath a lavender dawn. The air smells faintly of wet stone and smoke. Somewhere in the city below, a baker curses his oven, a senator rehearses a speech, and an emperor, barely in his 20s, is already making plans that would make a modern PR manager cry. Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, yes, his full name sounds like it was designed for dramatic effect, became emperor at 17. Imagine giving the world's most impulsive teenager control of an empire, an army, and a limitless budget for public entertainment. He wasn't born into normality. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was equal parts ambition and perfume. She believed destiny could be bullied into cooperation. She married her own uncle, Emperor Claudius, and then, according to strong suspicion and faintly polite historians, helped speed his journey into the afterlife with a dish of suspicious mushrooms. The Romans didn't write subtle biographies. Under Agrippina's careful manipulation, young Nero was groomed for greatness. Adopted by Claudius, tutored by Seneca, the philosopher who believed in self-control and virtue, which is tragic in retrospect. By 16, Nero was emperor in all but name. By 17, he was emperor, and by 18, he had developed what might be described as a flair for the dramatic. One of his first official acts was to deliver a speech written by Seneca, full of humility and reason. Rome adored it. At last, they said, a philosopher on the throne. Then, Nero spent the next decade proving that philosophers make terrible emperors. But let's be fair, he wasn't always monstrous. For a while, he was simply weirdly enthusiastic. He loved the arts more than politics, performance more than policy. He played the lyre, recited poetry, and believed deeply that Rome would benefit from hearing him sing. Often, in the evenings, the emperor would gather friends, senators, and half-willing dignitaries into candlelit halls. Servants dimmed the torches, the audience sighed politely, and Nero, draped in silk and sincerity, would begin his latest tragic composition. He played with passion, often tears streaming down his face, demanding absolute silence. One senator was said to have faked his own death just to escape the performance. But that was Nero, beautiful madness wrapped in gold and ego. Historians still debate whether his love of the arts was genuine or pathological. A man seeking applause in a city that demanded conquest. What we do know is that he blurred the line between ruler and performer. Rome expected an emperor. Nero gave them theatre. And, as with all actors, He needed a stage. He built one, a literal one, so he could perform publicly. The Senate was horrified. Emperors didn't sing in public. They conquered nations, but Nero didn't see the difference. In his mind, music was conquest, the soul's empire. He called his performances divine. His critics called them long. And while he tuned his lyre and practiced emotional gestures, his empire began to simmer beneath him. Taxes rising, grain supplies dwindling, enemies sharpening their knives. Rome was a cauldron, and Nero was the chef who thought the smoke was atmospheric lighting. Still, the people loved him, at least for a time. He was generous with festivals, games, and lavish gifts, bread and circuses, the most reliable form of ancient political anesthesia. It's late evening now. In this memory of Rome, the lamps flicker, the marble halls echo with laughter and music, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolls. Or perhaps it isn't thunder at all. Perhaps it's the beginning of something burning, because the night Nero's legend truly ignited, quite literally, is still to come. But first, there's a mother to outmaneuver, a wife to replace, and an empire's patience to test. Sleepy sarcasm aside, the truth of Nero's life is almost too dramatic for fiction. It's the story of a boy born to ambition, raised on manipulation, and handed a crown heavy enough to bend the neck of a god. For now we leave him in his prime, adored, admired, and unaware that history is already sharpening its quill. The year is 59 CE, and Rome smells of sea salt and scandal. Nero, now in his early 20s, has a problem, and her name is Agrippina. She is, inconveniently, both his mother and the only person in the empire who still believes she can tell him what to do. Imagine living with the world's most controlling parent, except she has an army, a private fortune, and the loyalty of half the Senate. At first, Nero adored her. He built statues in her honor, praised her in public, and even placed her face on his coins. That's ancient Rome's version of a social media shout-out. But soon, her influence began to grate. Agrippina attended Senate meetings, interrupted discussions, and occasionally reminded Nero loudly that the empire was technically her idea. Nero's pride, unfortunately, was allergic to authority, and Agrippina's ambition was allergic to sharing power. Their relationship began to look less like family and more like a Shakespearean rehearsal with real daggers. The tension reached a breaking point when Nero fell in love with Poppaea Sabina, a woman known for her beauty, wit, and near-lethal charm. Agrippina disapproved. Naturally, Nero decided to marry her. Now, here's your first historical fact of the section. Agrippina had already survived several assassination attempts earlier in her life, including one where her enemies tried to drown her by sabotaging a boat. She swam to shore, calmly brushed off the seawater, and returned to Rome furious and alive. This earned her a reputation as a woman impossible to kill and equally impossible to please. Your second fact: in 59 CE, Nero invited his mother on a reconciliation voyage along the Bay of Naples. It was meant to appear as a tender family outing, a son and mother setting aside politics. The ship was beautifully built, freshly tarred and very slightly designed to fall apart. Yes, it was a collapsible boat. When it sank, Agrippina once again refused to die on schedule. She swam ashore again and sent a message to Nero assuring him she was safe. He, predictably, panicked. The entire empire watched as the emperor's accidental boating mishap transformed into one of Rome's least convincing tragedies. Historians still debate the details of what came next. Some say Nero sent assassins under the cover of night. Others claim he ordered her struck down in her villa. All agree that Agrippina met her end with her famous final line, "Strike my womb first, for it bore such a son." Rome took note. The empire's golden boy had turned patricidal. Here's your obscure tidbit. After Agrippina's death, Nero reportedly experienced nightmares of her ghost, so persistent that he brought in magicians to perform rituals to exorcise her spirit. He even avoided the sea for years afterward, perhaps haunted by the sound of her swimming. And yet, to the public, he seemed unshaken. He held games, he commissioned plays, he wrote poetry about fate and freedom and mothers who didn't understand art. His grief, such as it was, became performance. But something shifted in him. His music grew darker, his nights longer, his laughter louder and more forced. Rome began to sense that something behind those golden curls and charming speeches had cracked. In the palaces, whispers spread. The Senate grew nervous. Even his tutor Seneca began writing letters filled with veiled concern. But Nero brushed it all aside. He had conquered his greatest critic, he thought, and yet Rome had a way of keeping score. Soon the city would burn, and with it the last illusion of control. But that's a fire for another night. For now, Nero sits beneath a golden ceiling, strumming his lyre, the soft sound echoing off marble. Outside, the wind shifts, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke, so faint he doesn't yet notice. And you, dear listener, exhale slowly. The night deepens. You've seen the seeds of an empire's madness planted in silk and candlelight. Tomorrow, we'll watch them bloom in flame. The smell of smoke lingers in the imagination long before it reaches the nose. That's how Rome must have felt in the summer of 64 CE, uneasy, restless, like the air itself was whispering warnings no one could quite hear. Nero, ever the artist, had decided to throw one of his grandest parties yet. Torches flickered along the marble gardens of his Domus Transitoria, and the city glittered like a crown under stars. But outside those walls, something small, something invisible, had begun to glow. A fire, not a glorious one, not the kind that poets romanticize, just an ember tucked somewhere in the slums near the Circus Maximus. The kind of fire that starts with a gust of wind and ends with a line in a history book. By morning, half of Rome was burning. By nightfall, it was an inferno. Roofs collapsed, Thames cracked, and the narrow streets of the Subura became rivers of flame. The sound wasn't screaming, not at first, but the low roar of everything human being reduced to smoke. Nero was nowhere to be seen. Some said he fled the city. Others said he stood on a balcony, watching it burn, singing of Troy's destruction, while plucking his lyre. The image is irresistible. The emperor bathed in firelight, composing tragedy as his empire melts. But, as with most things in history, truth and legend took wine together and blurred the edges. Here's your first major fact. The Great Fire of Rome lasted for 6 days and 7 nights. When it finally stopped, 2/3 of the city lay in ashes. Your second fact, ancient sources, notably Tacitus, who was not Nero's biggest fan, claimed that the emperor opened his private gardens to refugees and personally oversaw relief efforts. It's possible he did try to help, at least at first. It's equally possible he saw opportunity glowing in the ruins, because after the smoke cleared, Nero had an idea as extravagant as his ego. He would rebuild Rome not as it was, but as it should have been. A city of wide marble avenues, grand plazas, and a palace that made the gods jealous. He called it the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Imagine it. 300 acres of splendor, walls coated in ivory and gold leaf, dining rooms with rotating ceilings that rained flower petals on guests, an artificial lake, gardens stretching into the horizon, and at the center, a colossal statue of himself 100 feet tall. It was less of a home and more of a declaration. I am Rome now. Historians still debate whether Nero's architectural ambition was madness or vision. Some call him the father of urban planning. Others, the arsonist who built his dream on ashes. And here's your obscure tidbit. Rumor spread that Nero had ordered the fire himself to clear space for his project. He denied it, of course, but when the marble dust settled, his enemies needed no more proof than the palace's golden walls. To calm the city, Nero blamed someone new, an obscure religious sect from Judea, known for their strange rituals and talk of salvation, the Christians. He accused them of arson, treason, impiety, anything that would turn public fury away from his name. And Rome, desperate for a villain, found one. What followed was one of history's darkest misdirections. Tortures made of men, executions staged as entertainment, faith turned into fuel. Even in the haze of history, you can still feel the cruelty glowing faintly. Rome rebuilt itself on smoke, spectacle, and silence. As the fires cooled and the new marble gleamed, Nero walked his new halls, lyre in hand, his reflection dancing across golden walls. He'd won, or thought he had, but fame, like fire, eats its own. The city whispered behind him. Senators smirked in shadows. Generals began to imagine the empire without him. And in the quiet of his new palace, Nero began to imagine an empire that would finally appreciate his art, because what Rome needed, he decided, wasn't order. It was performance, and he would give them one they'd never forget. When emperors go mad, they rarely do it quietly. After the Great Fire, Nero became obsessed, not with rebuilding Rome's glory, but with starring in it. His reign shifted from administration to spectacle, from rule to rehearsal. He was no longer merely emperor. He was Rome's leading man, playwright, singer, poet, charioteer, and self-declared genius. He organized festivals in his own honor, staged elaborate performances, and even entered musical competitions across Greece. The twist: no one else was allowed to win. Your first historical fact: in 66 CE, Nero toured Greece in what can only be described as the world's first imperial concert tour. He performed in every major city: Corinth, Delphi, Olympia, reciting poetry and singing for hours while dignitaries pretended to enjoy themselves. Your second fact: he even competed in the Olympic Games, entering the chariot race despite his lack of, well, chariot skills. He fell mid-race, failed to finish, and was still awarded first place for participation. Historians still debate whether this was satire, sincerity, or a sign of delusion. Some accounts describe cheering crowds, others terrified silence. The line between applause and survival blurred long before the final act. And here's your obscure tidbit: Nero's vanity extended to his portraits. He commissioned artists to paint him as Apollo, the god of light and music, complete with halo-like rays around his head. He even tried to rename Rome Neropolis. The Senate miraculously managed to decline. Meanwhile, reality grew thin. Taxation rose to fund his fantasies. The treasury bled dry, while provinces rebelled. But Nero saw all this as noise. The audience coughing during his solo. He didn't govern the empire anymore. He curated its mood. He even began designing public performances of sorrow. When his wife Poppaea died, allegedly after one of Nero's infamous temper tantrums, he organized her funeral like an opera: music, incense, scripted tears. Later, he had a statue made of her and declared her divine. It was grief as theater, devotion as brand management. Seneca, his old tutor, tried one last time to reason with him. Power, he wrote, should serve the soul, not consume it. Nero responded by ordering his former teacher's execution. Even for Rome, that was considered bad manners. Whispers of revolt grew louder. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, began to question their loyalties. Generals in Spain and Gaul raised their standards against him. And in the midst of this collapsing empire, Nero decided to write a new song. He wanted to perform it live for the people as his redemption arc, but the audience never showed. The applause had finally stopped. One night, messengers arrived at his palace gates with news. The Senate had declared him a public enemy. His guards deserted him. His friends vanished. For the first time, the man who demanded silence was surrounded by it. He fled Rome with a few loyal servants. The dawn was pale. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked. Nero paused and asked, "Is this the sound of the world despising me?" Historians still debate his final moments. Some say he wept, whispering, "What an artist dies in me." Others claim he took his own life before his enemies could. However it happened, the curtain fell quietly on a life that had always demanded thunder, and Rome, ever dramatic, responded in kind. The people mourned, not for the tyrant, but for the performer, the mad poet who burned a city and called it art. Centuries later, his name would become shorthand for decadence, cruelty, and vanity. But somewhere behind that smoke and scandal, there lingers the faint, human echo of what he truly was, a boy-handed divinity before he learned humility. Outside, the eternal city smoulders and cools, the marble gleaming faintly in the new dawn. And you, dear listener, drift somewhere between history and dream, hearing the soft hiss of fire fading into silence. Tomorrow night we'll meet the others, Rome's long line of emperors who tried, failed, and occasionally outdid even Nero in strangeness. But for now, the stage is dark, the city sleeps, and the lyre is quiet at last. The flames of Nero's reign may have burned out, but Rome was never one for quiet endings. The empire didn't rest, it rebalanced. It exhaled smoke and inhaled ambition again. The stage that Nero left empty was quickly crowded by men who'd been waiting in the wings, each convinced they were the one Rome truly needed. Spoiler, most of them were wrong. It was the year of the 4 emperors, 69 CE, a year so chaotic it felt like history itself was playing musical thrones. Imagine Rome as a massive, glittering beast with 1,000 heads, all snarling, gossiping, conspiring. Senators sharpening their rhetoric, generals sharpening their swords, and the people sharpening their opinions. When Nero died, the empire woke up as if from a bad dream, only to find itself in another. First came Galba, an elderly general who'd been governor in Spain. He entered Rome not as a hero, but as a man carrying the weight of stability. He promised to restore order and discipline, words that sounded good in theory and terrible in practice. Within 7 months, even his bodyguards hated him. Your first historical fact: Galba's fatal mistake was his thrift. He cancelled the soldiers' bonuses promised by Nero and ordered executions left and right to show firmness. The Praetorian Guard decided firmness was overrated and killed him in the street. Next up was Otho, a charming opportunist with a talent for wine and whispering. He had been Nero's drinking buddy once, which in Rome was both a recommendation and a curse. Otho bought the loyalty of the guards, literally, with gold, and declared himself emperor. Your second fact: Otho's reign lasted 3 months. He fought a civil war against Vitellius, another general claiming the throne, and when he lost, he didn't flee or beg. He simply wrote a note, took his own life, and asked to be buried quickly to spare the empire more bloodshed. A small moment of dignity in an undignified era. And here's your obscure tidbit. When Otho's body was found, soldiers reportedly kissed his hands and wept, swearing they'd never serve another emperor so noble, which is ironic given that within hours they pledged loyalty to Vitellius. Vitellius, for his part, approached leadership the way Nero approached poetry, dramatically and without restraint. He threw banquets that lasted for days, funded by looting the treasury and temples alike. He was described as the belly of the empire, a man of enormous appetite and very little self-awareness. Historians still debate whether Vitellius' downfall came from poor strategy or poor digestion. By the end of the year, yet another general, Vespasian, marched from the eastern provinces, crushed Vitellius's forces, and finally restored something like order. Under Vespasian, Rome stopped spinning quite so fast. He was practical, wry, and far less theatrical than his predecessors. He built not for glory, but for longevity. The empire exhaled. But the scars of the past decade lingered. Rome had tasted instability. It knew now how quickly gods could fall and fools could rule. Still, as empires do, it turned tragedy into entertainment and began the next act. And Vespasian, ever the pragmatist, decided that what Rome needed most was a stadium. It started as a project of peace, an amphitheater, he called it, something for the people, a gesture of stability and civic pride. After years of war and excess, Vespasian wanted Rome to gather again, not for rebellion, but for spectacle. The Flavian Amphitheater, as it was known then, would become one of the most famous buildings in the world. You know it by another name, the Colosseum. Picture it as it stood on opening day, its stone white as bone, its tiers filled with 50,000 spectators, its awnings stretching like sails to shade the crowd. Beneath the arena floor lay a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, and lifts, all designed to surprise, entertain, and occasionally horrify. Your first major fact: construction began around 70 CE, funded not by taxes, but by the spoils of war, specifically the riches taken after the Roman siege of Jerusalem. The Jewish captives from that war were forced to build the amphitheater itself. Your second fact: the Colosseum wasn't just for gladiators. It hosted mock naval battles, animal hunts, and even theatrical reenactments of myths where prisoners were killed in place of the heroes. Rome didn't just tell stories, it performed them to death. And here's your obscure tidbit. To mask the stench of blood and sweat, perfumed water was sometimes sprayed into the air through bronze pipes. The Romans called it air fragrans, fragrant air. They'd invented ancient aromatherapy just to make murder smell nicer. Vespasian's vision was brilliant in its cynicism. Give the people bread, give them circuses, and they'll forget who built them on bones. He once joked about taxing public toilets, saying, "Money doesn't smell, practical, dry, and chillingly Roman." Historians still debate whether he truly believed in the Colosseum's moral purpose or simply its usefulness. His son Titus, who finished the project after Vespasian's death, claimed it was an act of devotion to the people. But even as marble gleamed, the empire darkened. The Colosseum became both symbol and mirror, a monument to human engineering and human cruelty, shining bright while the empire began its slow decay from within. Titus inaugurated it in 80 C with 100 days of games. The records say over 9,000 animals died, but the crowd cheered, the dust rose, the drums thundered. Rome was content again, numb but content. For a moment, under the roar of the masses, it seemed peace had returned. But peace in Rome was just a brief pause between emperors. As night fell over the arena, torches flickering against ancient stone, the new dynasty stood above the crowd, smiling. And somewhere deep beneath their feet, in the tunnels where slaves waited, another fire smoldered, unseen, inevitable. The Colosseum would outlive them all, and you, drifting somewhere between past and sleep, can almost hear the echo of its crowds fading into the dark. The dust of the Colosseum had barely settled when the empire turned inward again. Rome was vast, too vast, and its emperors, as always, began to mistake their reflections for the sun. After Vespasian came his son, Titus, the good emperor they called him, handsome, measured, almost unnervingly normal by Roman standards. He finished his father's grand projects, including the Colosseum, and ruled with a gentleness that made Rome sigh in relief. But Rome never trusts calm for long. Your first major fact: Titus' reign lasted only 2 years, from 79 to 81 CE. But those years contained disaster upon disaster. Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash and time. The following year, a fire destroyed much of Rome again. Then came plague. It was as though the gods had decided to test his patience. And, as usual, the gods won. Your second fact: when Pompeii fell, Titus ordered immense rescue efforts and compensation for survivors. He even set up a relief fund financed from his own imperial treasury. It was a rare act of compassion from a throne that usually measured value in loyalty, not lives. And here's your obscure tidbit. When Titus died suddenly at just 41, rumors spread that his younger brother Domitian had hurried the process along. Ancient writers note that the official cause was a fever, which in Rome was shorthand for no questions, please. Domitian didn't bother pretending otherwise. He stepped into power like a man born for it. If Nero had been Rome's artist and Vespasian its accountant, Domitian was its control freak. He rebuilt the empire's bureaucracy, reinforced its borders, and made sure everyone, senators, servants, even statues, remembered who ruled them. He was also paranoid, vain, and deeply superstitious. He insisted on being addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Modesty, clearly, was in short supply. He installed mirrors around his palace so no one could approach from behind. He banned figs from the palace because an oracle had once predicted he would die during fig season. Spoiler, he did. Historians still debate whether Domitian's tyranny was efficient or simply oppressive. He improved the empire's finances, strengthened the army, and even revalued the currency, but ruled with a suffocating air of suspicion. Under his reign, the Senate became less a council and more an audience, nodding on cue, applauding on demand. He executed or exiled thousands of supposed conspirators, many of whom were guilty only of existing too confidently in his presence. The irony: for all his paranoia, his end came not from the Senate or the army, but from his own servants. One morning in 96 CE, as he read letters in his private chamber, they struck a dagger between ribs, silence, and a sigh of relief across the empire. And yet, his death marked something rare in Roman history, an opportunity for balance. The next rulers would bring Rome its last great age of reason before the long shadows returned. For now, the city rests under a silver moon. The marble gleams, the empire breathes evenly for the first time in decades. But in Rome, peace is just the pause before the next performance. Rome's golden hour arrived quietly, without the trumpet blasts or ego that usually heralded emperors. It began with Nerva, a man so old and unassuming that senators likely exhaled in collective relief when he took the throne after Domitian's death. He promised reform, forgiveness, and no more surprise executions at breakfast. The people didn't love him, but they didn't fear him either, which was a start. Nerva knew his limits. He had no army, no heirs, and no illusions of immortality. So, in a stroke of practical genius, he adopted a successor, not his son, not his nephew, but a respected general named Trajan. It was an unprecedented move. Succession by merit, not blood. Your first major fact: Trajan, adopted in 97 CE, would become one of Rome's most beloved emperors. Under his rule, the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from the Atlantic to the Persian Gulf. Your second fact: Trajan wasn't just a conqueror, he was a builder. He constructed massive public works, bridges, roads, aqueducts, and the famous Trajan's Forum, a masterpiece of marble and order. At its heart stood Trajan's Column, a towering monument carved with 155 scenes of his military campaigns. It still stands today, telling a story that spirals upward through time. And here's your obscure tidbit. Trajan was so admired that centuries later, the Catholic Church, yes, the Church, declared him an honorary Christian soul. Despite his paganism, the reasoning: he ruled with justice and mercy, a rare endorsement from eternity. Trajan's Rome was efficient, clean, and confident. Trade flowed like wine. The streets bustled with citizens who finally believed their empire might last forever. Of course, forever is a fragile concept. When Trajan died, he passed the mantle to Hadrian, his distant cousin and fellow visionary. Hadrian was less a conqueror and more a curator. He abandoned insustainable conquests and focused on consolidation, turning borders into masterpieces of defense. The most famous of these, of course, is Hadrian's Wall in Britain, a barrier of stone and turf stretching nearly 80 miles across the island, marking the empire's northern edge. It wasn't meant to keep enemies out, exactly, but to remind everyone where Rome ended and the rest of the world began. Historians still debate whether Hadrian built the wall out of strategy or simple exasperation. Britain's weather, after all, had driven better men to madness. And your second strange detail for the night: Hadrian personally toured nearly every province of his empire, often barefoot, mingling with soldiers, studying architecture, and sketching plans for temples and gardens. One might call him Rome's first travel blogger, minus the hashtags. He was a lover of art, of Greek philosophy, and of one man in particular, Antinous, a young companion whose beauty was said to rival the gods. When Antinous drowned in the Nile under mysterious circumstances, Hadrian was inconsolable. He deified the boy, built cities in his name, and filled the empire with statues of his face, an entire cult of memory born from grief. Historians still debate whether Antinous' death was an accident, a sacrifice, or something more intimate and deliberate. Whatever the truth, Hadrian's mourning reshaped art for generations. So, as you drift deeper into this story, imagine Rome not as an empire of blood, but of marble dreams, where rulers built walls to hold back chaos and monuments to hold back time. The fires have cooled, the liars are silent. For a brief, golden stretch of history, reason reigns, and in that quiet lull, the empire hums softly, half asleep, half divine. By the time Hadrian's hair turned silver, the empire he had shaped gleamed like polished marble, strong, ordered, and deceptively serene. His walls held the barbarians at bay, his roads tied the world together, and his cities mirrored his quiet obsession with symmetry. But even marble cracks, and every wall, no matter how strong, keeps out as much as it traps within. Hadrian's twilight years were spent wandering his gardens actively, a paradise of pools, pavilions, and colonnades, where the scent of cypress and myrtle drifted in the breeze. There, among the fountains and the ghosts of his memories, he grew old and melancholic. He wrote poetry, soft, weary verses about the soul leaving the body. He attended plays but smiled rarely. His final act of rule, however, was one of foresight. Your first major fact. Knowing his time was short, Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius, a man of measured kindness and impeccable reputation. But the deal came with a condition. Antoninus had to, in turn, adopt a promising young man named Marcus Aurelius. It was the most successful imperial succession plan in history. 3 wise rulers spanning nearly a century of relative peace. Your second fact, Antoninus Pius ruled for 23 years without major wars or executions. He was called pious because he honored Hadrian's memory when others would have erased it. His reign was so calm that later historians struggled to fill the pages. There were no scandals, no conquests, no chaos, just quiet competence. And here's your obscure tidbit. Antoninus never left Italy once during his entire reign. He ruled by letter, by delegation, by faith in his governors. It's said he could recite the names of every senator by heart, a detail that seems both impressive and slightly obsessive. Historians still debate whether his stillness was strength or stagnation. But after a century of fires and madmen, Rome needed stillness, like lungs need air. When Antonius died peacefully in his bed, a Roman rarity, Marcus Aurelius took the throne, and with it, the weight of the world. He was philosopher first, emperor second, stoic by training, reluctant by nature. He preferred books to banquets, reflection to revelry. His reign began as a study in reason and ended as a study in endurance, because fate, as always, has terrible timing. Not long after his accession, the northern tribes, those restless shadows beyond Hadrian's wall, rose up. The Parthians threatened in the east. Plague returned. The calm of the Antonine years cracked like old marble, and Marcus Aurelius, the man who wrote about virtue and acceptance, found himself fighting wars in Francine mud. His soldiers called him the philosopher in armor. He slept in tents, ate with the ranks, and wrote at night by lamplight. His meditations, those quiet reflections, still read today, weren't written in peace, but in the pause between battles. Historians still debate whether Marcus's strength lay in his philosophy or in his endurance. He ruled with compassion and discipline, refusing to surrender to tyranny or despair. But even the wisest man cannot outthink mortality or heredity, because while Marcus was waging war on the empire's edges, his son back home was preparing to wage war on its soul. If Marcus Aurelius was Rome's philosopher king, his son Commodus was its fever dream. When the emperor died in 180 CE, the empire mourned a sage and inherited a showman. Commodus was only 18, handsome, athletic, and, unfortunately, convinced that he was Hercules reborn. At first, the people loved him. He promised peace. He cancelled unpopular taxes. He smiled often and threw grand games. But like many who follow greatness, Commodus mistook inheritance for immortality. Your first major fact: Commodus renamed Rome after himself, calling it Colonia Commodiana. He renamed the month, the legions, even the Senate. Every law began with his name. It was Nero's ego with biceps. Your second fact: unlike previous emperors who merely watched gladiatorial games, Commodus participated in them. He fought in the arena, dressed as a gladiator, slaying animals or, more often, heavily bribed opponents, while the Senate was forced to cheer. Historians still debate whether these performances were courage or madness. Cassius Dio, a senator who survived his reign, wrote that watching the emperor fight was as terrifying as it was humiliating. And here's your obscure tidbit: Commodus had a personal workshop that melted down the bronze statues of previous emperors to recast them as images of himself. It was recycling, Roman style, symbolic, narcissistic, and very on brand. He also developed an obsession with renaming everything after his own glory. The Colosseum became the Commodian Arena. The legions were now the immortal Commodians. Even Rome's grain supply was the gift of Commodus. Eventually, the Senate decided that Rome could not survive being commodified. Plots formed, assassins failed, friends betrayed friends. Finally, in 192 CE, one of his concubines, Marci, poisoned his wine. When that didn't work quickly enough, his wrestling partner strangled him in his bath. And just like that, Rome's last son of greatness died in a moment of absurd intimacy, killed not by armies or enemies, but by the hands of those closest to him. The Senate declared him a public enemy, his statues smashed, his name erased, but the damage lingered. The age of philosophers and builders was over. The age of survival had begun. For the next 100 years, emperors would come and go, like shadows, soldiers, schemers and survivors. The golden marble would fade, the borders would strain, and the empire, once so sure of its eternity, would begin to feel time pressing down. But for tonight, let's stay in this flickering half-light of the 2nd century, where the fires are faint, the air smells of wine and dust, and the world still pretends not to notice its own decline, because sometimes history doesn't fall, it sighs. The 3rd century dawned not with trumpets, but with the sound of swords being unsheathed far too often. Rome, for all its marble and might, began to fray like an old tapestry, still grand in colour, but pulled apart at the edges. The death of Commodus had left behind more than scandal. It left behind a vacuum, and Rome, as history likes to remind us, despised vacuums. Into that void marched men with ambition, legions with loyalty, and senators with shaky spines. The next decades would become what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, a term that sounds neatly academic until you realize it meant 50 years of near constant civil war, famine, and plague. Your first major fact: between 235 and 284 CE, Rome saw over 20 emperors rise and fall. Some ruled for years, others for months, and a few for what must have felt like extended lunch breaks. The empire fractured into pieces: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, each claiming to be the true Rome. It was as if the empire had grown so vast it no longer remembered where its heartbeat was. And yet, amid all this chaos, there were glimmers of brilliance. Take Septimius Severus, for example, a North African-born general who seized power in 1930 CE after another round of imperial musical chairs. He was cunning, pragmatic, and utterly unapologetic about being both foreign-born and power-hungry. He expanded the army, fortified the borders, and ruled through sheer force of personality. Your second fact: Severus was also the first emperor to march his sons, Caracalla and Geta, into power alongside him. Believing family unity could stabilize Rome, it did not. After Severus's death, the brothers ruled jointly for less than a year before Caracalla had Geta murdered during what was supposed to be a reconciliation meeting in their mother's arms. The blood, it's said, splattered across her dress. Historians still debate whether Severus's dying advice, enrich the soldiers and despise all others, was wisdom or the beginning of Rome's undoing. And here's your obscure tidbit: Caracalla, despite his murderous tendencies, did something profoundly egalitarian. He granted Roman citizenship to nearly every free man in the empire. The Edict of Caracalla in 212 CE turned millions of subjects into citizens overnight. His motives, however, were less noble than fiscal. More citizens meant more taxes. Still, it's an oddly modern moment, an emperor turning blood into bureaucracy. But power, as always, was fickle. Caracalla's reign ended in typical Roman fashion: stabbed to death by a disgruntled soldier while relieving himself by the roadside. The empire lurched on, bleeding from every seam. Emperors came and went, each proclaiming divine favor, each toppled by the next sword sharper than his own. The gods, it seemed, had grown tired of choosing favorites, and as the 3rd century stumbled on, it would take one man, an unlikely savior from the edge of nowhere, to stitch the empire's shredded fabric back together. Enter Diocletian, the emperor who did what no poet could. He took chaos, divided it neatly in half, and called it order. By the time he rose to power in 284 CE, Rome was exhausted. Armies had become auctioneers, selling the throne to the highest bidder. The Senate was ceremonial, the economy hyperinflated, and the frontiers leaking like old wine barrels. Diocletian was not born noble. He was a soldier from Dalmatia, a province better known for its mountains than its manners. But he had something Rome desperately needed: discipline and a deep, almost obsessive love for structure. Your first major fact: Diocletian reorganized the empire into what he called the tetrarchy, or rule of four. He divided power between two senior emperors Augusti and two juniors Caesars, each ruling a region, but united under one system. It was the world's first attempt at bureaucratic cloning. Your second fact: he also reformed the economy, introducing a standardized currency and issuing the edict on maximum prices, an ancient attempt at inflation control. It listed fixed prices for everything, from wheat to a lion for the arena. The lion's price, by the way, was steep. Historians still debate whether Diocletian's reforms saved or strangled Rome. The economy stabilized, but only under suffocating control. Soldiers and farmers were forbidden to change professions, binding generations to their father's work. The empire began to look less like a republic reborn and more like a well-managed prison. And here's your obscure tidbit: Diocletian was the only emperor in Roman history to retire voluntarily. In 305 CE, he stepped down, retreating to his seaside villa in modern Croatia, where he grew cabbages and refused every request to return. When asked years later if he would resume power, he replied, "If you could see the cabbages I grow, you'd never ask." After decades of chaos, the man who fixed Rome found peace, not in marble halls, but in a garden. There's something profoundly human about that. His system, the tetrarchy, didn't survive him, of course. Ambition always breaks its own symmetry, but his reforms paved the way for the next era, one that would transform Rome forever. Because while Diocletian was growing vegetables by the Adriatic, another emperor was watching the sky for signs. He saw a cross of light above the sun, or so he claimed. And from that vision, the empire would be reborn. Not by fire this time, but by faith. The dawn that followed Diocletian's quiet retirement was no ordinary one. The old empire, hardened by war, disciplined by reform, and exhausted by ambition, was about to discover something entirely new: belief as power. Enter Constantine the Great, a man who would turn faith into strategy, politics into prophecy, and the Roman world on its head. When Constantine was born in the late 3rd century, Rome was a house divided. The tetrarchy, Diocletian's masterpiece of control, was collapsing into the same infighting it was designed to prevent. Every general saw himself as emperor. Every emperor saw his rivals as heretics. And then came a story that, whether divine or convenient, changed everything. The year was 312 CE. Two armies faced each other near the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome. Constantine, outnumbered and uncertain, looked up to the sky. He later claimed to have seen a sign, a cross of light above the sun, and the words, "In this sign, conquer." That night, he dreamed of Christ himself, telling him to mark his soldiers' shields with the Chi Rho, the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. Your first major fact: Constantine's army won the battle. His rival, Maxentius, drowned in the Tiber. Within a year, Constantine became the sole ruler of the Western Empire and the first Roman emperor to claim divine favor from the Christian God. Your second fact: in 313 CE, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance across the empire. After centuries of persecuting Christians, Rome now embraced them. Churches rose where temples once stood. The persecuted became powerful. Historians still debate whether Constantine's conversion was genuine faith or brilliant politics. It likely began as the latter and became the former. Rome had always believed in gods that helped it win. And here's your obscure tidbit. After his victory, Constantine built a new capital, a city of domes, mosaics, and shimmering harbors. He named it Nova Roma, New Rome, but the world would remember it as Constantinople, the city where East met West and where old gods quietly faded into the mists. It was a masterpiece of geography and symbolism, close to trade routes, defensible by sea, and bathed in light that shimmered off golden domes. Rome had a new heart, and, perhaps without realizing it, a new soul. Under Constantine, Christianity became not just tolerated, but celebrated. Bishops gained power, pagan temples emptied, statues of Jupiter stood beside crosses for a time. But the balance was shifting. The emperor himself acted as mediator between heaven and earth, between altar and throne. He summoned councils of bishops, debated theology, and carried the weight of empire and eternity in the same breath. In one lifetime, the divine had become doctrine, and the empire that once crucified believers now built cathedrals in their honor. But faith, like power, breeds division. Constantine's heirs would fight over it, theologians would bleed over it, and the empire, reborn in marble and light, would fracture again, this time not by sword, but by creed. Still, for one glittering moment, Rome believed itself eternal again, and under Constantine's gaze, bathed in golden dawn, the empire almost seemed to believe it too. If Constantine's Rome glowed with newfound faith, his sons inherited only the embers and promptly argued over who should own the fire. After his death in 337 CE, the empire was divided among his three sons, Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius II. Predictably, within a few years, only one was left alive. The others fell not to foreign foes, but to family ambition, a Roman tradition as old as the empire itself. Your first major fact: Constantius II ruled longest, spending much of his reign defending the empire's eastern borders against Persia, while refereeing the great theological battle of the age, the nature of Christ himself. Was he divine, human, both? Neither, theologians argued. Bishops were exiled. Empires nearly split over adjectives. This was the era of the Arian controversy, named after Arius, a priest who claimed that Jesus was subordinate to God the Father. His ideas spread like wildfire, and Constantine's sons spent decades trying to extinguish it, without understanding that belief cannot be managed by decree. Your second fact: in 361 CE, the imperial pendulum swung in the opposite direction. Julian, known to history as Julian the Apostate, came to power and tried to reverse Christianity's rise altogether. Educated, eloquent, and deeply nostalgic for the old gods, Julian reopened pagan temples, reinstated sacrifices, and dreamed of restoring the empire's ancient spirit. But time is a ruthless tide. The world had moved on. His reforms were met with confusion, his vision with shrugs. Historians still debate whether Julian's pagan revival failed because of divine fate or human inertia. He died just 2 years later in battle against the Persians, pierced by a spear. Some say his last words were bitter and poetic. "You have won, Galilean, and here's your obscure tidbit." After Julian's death, Christian soldiers found his library filled with scrolls of philosophy, astronomy, and mysticism, all annotated in his own hand. They burned most of it. Rome had learned that books could be as dangerous as blades. By the end of the 4th century, the transformation was complete. The Emperor Theodosius I outlawed pagan worship entirely. The temples of Jupiter and Apollo were shuttered. The fires of Vesta, the eternal flame of the Roman spirit, were extinguished after 1,000 years of burning. Marble gods were toppled, melted, repurposed. Statues of Zeus became saints. Basilicas rose where forums had stood. Rome, the empire of conquest, had become the empire of faith. Its soldiers marched beneath crosses now, not eagles. Its wars were holy, its victories divine. Historians still debate whether this was salvation or surrender, but the world had changed forever, and as the old gods faded, something else began to stir on the horizon. A storm from the north, where cold winds carried whispers of tribes and kings who did not kneel to emperors, divine or otherwise. The marble was cracking again, this time not from within, but from the footsteps of strangers. Section 15. The wind from the north carried more than chill. It carried inevitability. By the dawn of the 5th century, Rome had become 2 Romes, one rich and shimmering in the east at Constantinople, the other weary and trembling in the west. They were sisters, sharing blood, but not destiny. The Eastern Empire had walls, wealth, and wisdom enough to endure. The Western one, our old, beloved Rome, was a magnificent ruin, pretending not to notice its own decay. Taxes soared, loyalty crumbled, and armies, once Rome's pride, were now stitched together with mercenaries from the very tribes the empire once called barbarians, Visigoths, Vandals, Franks. Names whispered like thunderclouds on the horizon. Your first major fact in 410 CE, under the Gothic king Alaric, those whispers became footsteps, and those footsteps became the unthinkable. Rome was sacked. For the first time in nearly 800 years, foreign warriors breached her gates. The city of emperors, philosophers, and poets was plundered over 3 long days. The sound of swords clashing echoed through marble courtyards once meant for poetry. Statues of gods were melted for coins. Gold dripped like tears down temple steps. And yet, it wasn't the end. Rome didn't burn to ash. It staggered, wounded, pride cracked, but pulse faintly beating. Your second fact, the sack of Rome, while catastrophic, was oddly restrained by ancient standards. Alaric ordered that churches be spared. Many Romans survived, but the psychological blow was enormous. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, summed it up with trembling simplicity. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. Historians still debate whether the fall of Rome began that day or long before, whether it was fire and sword that felled her or the slow suffocation of apathy and arrogance. And here's your obscure tidbit. When the Goths left, they carried with them one of Rome's strangest relics, a sacred hen believed to bring divine favor. Legend says it escaped and began a line of wild chickens that roamed the ruins for centuries. Rome, it seems, always found ways to mock her own tragedy. But if Alaric's sack was the first crack, the second came not long after, from across the sea. In 455 CE, the Vandals, a seafaring tribe from North Africa, sailed up the Tiber and plundered the city again. This time it was thorough. The word vandalism comes from this very moment, an empire stripped bare by those who once lived at its fringes. Rome's emperor fled, its senators cowered, its treasures vanished, and yet, somehow, the city endured, because Rome had always been more than walls or rulers. It was habit, it was memory, even in ruin. It still called itself eternal, but eternity has moods, and soon it would grow quiet. The twilight of the Western Roman Empire wasn't a single night. It was a long, weary dusk. After the Vandals, after the Goths, after centuries of fighting shadows, the empire began to shrink like old parchment. Provinces were abandoned, legions disappeared, emperors became figureheads, then names, then rumors. Imagine a city still holding ceremonies, still minting coins, still proclaiming Imperator Caesar Augustus, while weeds grew through the forum floor. Your first major fact: in 476 CE, the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, a boy barely 16, was deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer. The irony was rich. Rome's first emperor had been Augustus. Her last bore the same name. When news of the deposition spread, the Senate didn't riot. They simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging that the center of gravity had shifted east. The eternal city had finally admitted she was tired. Your second fact: the Eastern Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, continued for nearly 1,000 more years. The Romans never thought of themselves as fallen. They simply moved. Constantinople became the new Rome, and Latin slowly gave way to Greek, marble to mosaic, gods to saints. Historians still debate whether 476 truly marked the fall of Rome. In truth, it was less a fall and more a fading, like a candle burning too slowly to notice it's almost gone. And here's your obscure tidbit. Romulus Augustulus, the boy emperor, wasn't executed. Odoacer spared him, granted him a pension, and sent him to live quietly in the Italian countryside. The last ruler of Rome spent his days not in exile or agony, but in anonymity, perhaps tending gardens, like Diocletian before him. It's a strangely poetic ending. The empire that began with ambition ended with exhaustion, and its final emperor faded gently into obscurity rather than fire. Outside, the barbarians built kingdoms from Rome's ashes: Ostrogoths in Italy, Visigoths in Spain, Franks in Gaul. They borrowed Roman laws, Roman words, even Roman pride. Civilization didn't die. It simply changed its name. And in the east, Constantinople shone like a mirror held up to memory. A world trying to remember what it once was. The streets of the old city grew silent. Grass crept between stones. The baths stood empty. But at night, when the moonlight touched the ruins of the Forum, it was said that the stones still whispered Latin prayers to no one. Rome wasn't gone. She was dreaming. Centuries drift by, quietly, in the ruins of empire. The marble cracks, ivy blooms, languages shift, but ideas have a strange stubbornness. They sleep lightly. Long after the emperors were gone, Rome remained not as an empire, but as a memory that refused to decay. Her laws, her faith, her architecture, even her arrogance, all lingered in the bones of Europe like a heartbeat that had simply slowed. By the 6th century, under the golden domes of Constantinople, the flame flickered brighter again. The Eastern Empire, or Byzantium, became a living echo of the old world, though it had grown different, more spiritual, more ornate, more careful. And at its center stood a man who might as well have been born from the marble of Rome itself. Emperor Justinian I. He ruled from 527 to 565 CE, and he was determined to rebuild what time and invaders had undone. Ambitious, relentless, and occasionally terrifying, Justinian saw himself not as a caretaker, but as a restorer, a man chosen by God to sew the Roman world back together. Your first major fact: Justinian launched campaigns to reconquer the Western territories, Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. For a brief, shining moment, the empire's borders stretched wide again, echoing the old grandeur of Augustus. His generals, Belisarius and Narses, won stunning victories, but the cost, the cost was crushing. Gold drained, cities burned, and plague crept in through the ports. Your second fact: while soldiers bled abroad, Justinian built at home. His crowning masterpiece was the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom in Constantinople. When it was completed in 537 CE, its dome floated over the city like the sky itself had been trapped in stone. Even now, nearly 15 centuries later, it stands, a cathedral, a mosque, a museum, a miracle of geometry and grace. When Justinian first entered it, he is said to have cried out, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." Historians still debate whether Justinian was a visionary or a megalomaniac. Some called him the last Roman, others the first Byzantine. And here's your obscure tidbit: Justinian's wife, Theodora, once an actress of low birth, became one of the most powerful women in history. Brilliant, bold, and unflinching, she advised him through riots, diplomacy, and plague. When rebels stormed the capital during the Nicariates, Justinian nearly fled. It was Theodora who stopped him, saying, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." That sentence alone might have saved an empire. Together, they endured a revolt that burned half of Constantinople and left tens of thousands dead. Out of the ashes rose something magnificent, the Hagia Sophia, the codified laws of Justinian's code, and a legacy that would ripple through medieval Europe for 1,000 years. And yet, for all its brilliance, Byzantium lived in constant tension, half looking back to Rome's glory, half forward to its own uncertain eternity. When Justinian finally died, the empire he left behind gleamed like gold on the surface, but was cracked beneath. His conquests stretched too far, his taxes too deep, his faith too inflexible. Still, the dome of Hagia Sophia caught the sunlight each morning, and the city beneath it sang. Rome lived on, not in Latin or marble now, but in music, mosaics, and prayer. The empire of conquest had become an empire of faith and art, and as centuries turned, new winds began to blow, this time from the desert, carrying voices that would reshape not just Rome, but the entire world. The 7th century began with heat, real and metaphorical. From the Arabian Peninsula rose a new force, a movement so swift and certain it changed the rhythm of history itself. Islam. Within decades of the Prophet Muhammad's death, in 632, CE armies, bearing the crescent banner, swept through the old Roman lands. Syria, Egypt, North Africa, lands Byzantium had bled to keep. Your first major fact, between 634 and 750 CE, the Muslim caliphates captured 2/3 of the old Eastern Roman territories. Damascus, Alexandria, and Carthage, names once whispered in Latin, now hummed with Arabic prayer. Your second fact, the Byzantine Empire, led by Emperor Heraclius and his successors, survived only through resilience and reinvention. Heraclius restructured the army, introduced Greek as the empire's official language, and reorganized its provinces into themes, military districts designed to respond quickly to invasion. Historians still debate whether Heraclius saved Byzantium or merely prolonged its slow retreat. Either way, he bought it another 7 centuries of existence. No small feat for a world perpetually at war with itself. And here's your obscure tidbit. When Heraclius recaptured Jerusalem from the Persians in 630 CE, he personally carried the relic of the true cross back into the city barefoot, weeping. Yet, within a decade, that same city fell again, this time to Muslim armies. History, ever the ironic playwright, gave him glory only to take it back before the applause ended. Byzantium adapted as it always had. Its artists began to paint icons, holy images shimmering with gold, their faces solemn, stylized, eternal. These icons weren't mere decoration, they were windows into heaven. But even heaven can divide opinion. By the 8th century, the empire split over whether icons were sacred or sinful. The iconoclast controversy saw emperors destroy paintings, smash mosaics, and banish monks who disagreed. It wasn't just art, It was theology as warfare. Churches were gutted of beauty. Walls stood bare. The people whispered that even God had turned away. Historians still debate the motivations behind the iconoclast emperors: faith, politics, or fear. Perhaps they saw divine punishment in their endless wars and sought purification in destruction. But faith, like art, always returns. By the 9th century, icons were restored, more luminous than ever, and in their return, Byzantium rediscovered its balance, fragile, luminous, and hauntingly human. Meanwhile, in the West, something strange stirred among the ruins. Out of the ashes of old Rome rose a new emperor, a Frankish king crowned in a candlelit church on Christmas Day, 800 CE. His name was Charlemagne, and though he never set foot in Rome's Senate, he called himself Emperor of the Romans. The empire, it seemed, refused to die. It simply changed costumes. Section 19. The winter of the year 800 was cold, crisp, and heavy with ceremony. In the grand basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, candles flickered against marble columns. A crown waited on the altar. Outside, the city was a ghost of its former self, ruins and relics whispering of emperors long gone. But inside, history took a deep breath. On Christmas Day, Pope Leo III placed that crown upon the head of a broad-shouldered Frankish king, Charlemagne, ruler of the Franks and Lombards, conqueror of Europe's heartlands, and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The people shouted, "Long live Charles Augustus!" The choir sang, and the Roman Empire, which had ended in 476, was suddenly reborn, half memory, half miracle. Your first major fact: Charlemagne's coronation in 800 CE marked the creation of what would later be called the Holy Roman Empire, a name that was, as Voltaire once joked, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, but at that moment it was hope, a revival of order in a world of chaos. Your second fact: Charlemagne wasn't just a warrior, he was a reformer. He standardized currency, reformed education, and even revived Latin literacy among priests and scholars. His court at Aachen became a beacon of learning known as the Carolingian Renaissance. Under his rule, monks copied ancient texts by hand, preserving fragments of Plato, Virgil, and Aristotle that might have vanished forever. The empire of parchment and prayer was born from the ruins of empire and power. Historians still debate whether Charlemagne sought to restore Rome or to replace it. He likely wanted both, to be the emperor of the present and the echo of the past. And here's your obscure tidbit: Charlemagne was so tall, about 6'4", towering in an age of shorter men, that his subjects called him Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great. His bones, later exhumed by the Emperor Otto III, confirmed the legend, a man built on the scale of his ambition. But like all things built on memory, the Holy Roman Empire was fragile. After Charlemagne's death, his empire fractured among his heirs, divided and divided again, until it became less a realm and more a quilt, stitched together by oaths, faith, and habit. The East would call itself Romania, the true heir to Constantinople. The West would claim its crown through popes and coronations, and between them stretched 1,000 years of rivalry, sanctified by incense and sword. Meanwhile, the city that had once ruled the world became quiet again. Rome turned inward, its streets filled with monks instead of senators, its temples reborn as churches. The Forum was now a pasture for goats. The Colosseum was a fortress for barons. The empire that had once stretched across continents now lived in whispers and symbols. Still, the idea of Rome, its order, its grandeur, its promise, refused to die. Every king wanted to wear its shadow. Every priest wanted to borrow its sanctity. Every scholar dreamed of its return. The Middle Ages were not a darkness, as people later claimed. They were a long twilight in which Rome still glimmered faintly on the horizon. Like a star, you can see even after the sun is gone. But on that Christmas morning in 800, when Charlemagne rose, crowned and uncertain, the star flared once more. Rome, eternal and reinvented, had remembered her name. Time, ever indifferent, moved on. Centuries folded like parchment. Empires rose and fell in rhythm to the same song Rome had written long before. Ambition, conquest, decay, rebirth. By the year 1453, the last notes of that song trembled on the wind. In the east, Constantinople, once the jewel of the empire, stood encircled by the armies of the Ottoman Turks. Its emperor, Constantine XI's Palaiologos, bore the same name as the man who had first made it Rome's second heart. A symmetry that felt almost cruel. The city's walls, once deemed unbreachable, now faced cannon fire, gunpowder, the new language of war. Inside, the great dome of Hagia Sophia glowed with candlelight, and priests whispered prayers in Greek and Latin alike. Your first major fact, after a 53-day siege, on May 29th, 1453, Constantinople fell. The last emperor vanished in battle, his body never found. The Byzantine Empire, the last ember of Rome, was extinguished. Your second fact, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II entered the city, he rode straight to Hagia Sophia, dismounted, and declared it a mosque. But he forbade looting, restored order, and even kept the Christian mosaics intact beneath plaster, saying, "This shall remain the envy of the world." And here's your obscure tidbit. Before the fall, legend says, an angel appeared to a priest inside Hagia Sophia, telling him to place the Eucharist upon the altar, and that he would return to finish it when the church was restored. Centuries later, when restorers uncovered the mosaics, they found the altar cloth perfectly preserved beneath the dust, just as the story promised. Historians still debate when Rome truly ended. Was it in 476, when the last boy emperor in the West laid down his crown, or in 1453, when the crescent moon rose over Constantinople? Or did it never end at all, merely transform, surviving in our laws, our languages, our calendars, our architecture, even our dreams? Because if you walk through any modern city, Rome, Paris, London, Istanbul, you'll find Rome still there, hiding in the stones. reflected in the order of streets, the domes of cathedrals, the whispers of justice and empire. Every civilization since has lived in Rome's shadow, copying its shapes, inheriting its contradictions, its beauty and cruelty, its grandeur and exhaustion, its endless struggle between chaos and control. The empire is gone, yes, but its heartbeat lingers, steady, subtle, eternal. And now, dear listener, the story grows quiet. The fires have dimmed, the marble cooled. Across 2,000 years, the echo of sandals on stone fades into the hum of modern life. You've traveled from Nero's glowing madness to the solemn fall of Constantinople, from emperors with golden crowns to monks with ink-stained fingers, from chaos to calm and back again. What remains? After all of it, the wars, the walls, the whispers, is the strange endurance of human imagination. We build empires not to last forever, but to prove that we existed. We carve our dreams into stone so that, even when they crumble, their dust still glitters in the light. So breathe deeply now. Picture the Colosseum beneath the moon, empty and vast, its arches open to the stars. Picture the Hagia Sophia's dome glowing with soft light. Picture the quiet Tiber, flowing past broken columns, carrying secrets toward the sea. The world sleeps, but Rome still dreams. Let that dream carry you softly into yours. The story is finished, but the echoes remain. Good night, traveler of time, and may your own empire of thought never fall. Thank you for joining me tonight. Hope you enjoyed the story. If you're not in a deep sleep right now, enjoy the peaceful fireplace background and drift into peace.